Good evening. I'm Jeff Cowan, and it's my great pleasure to welcome to the Annenberg School Dr. Dorothy Height. I wanted to start this evening's proceedings, which are really a remarkable chance to talk about a great woman's life and a great period in, among other things, the civil rights struggle, by remembering one of the great men in the world of civil rights here in Los Angeles, a great journalist known to and friend to many of us, an editorial page writer for the Los Angeles Times, a man who spent many, many evenings with us on this stage, who died unexpectedly today of a heart attack at the age of 55. That man's name, and many of you here will know him, is Frank DeLomo. And I'd like to spend a moment remembering him with your own private way of doing so. Frank was a great man and reminds us of the importance that we attach to all of these important works that we do. I want to thank the sponsors of tonight's event so that I don't forget any of them: the California Endowment, British Petroleum, Northrop Grumman, and also our co-hosts this evening, which include the Office of External Relations at USC, the Rossier School of Education, the Program in American Studies and Ethnicity, the USC Black Alumni Association, and the USC Center for Black Cultural and Student Affairs. And of course, during the course of Dr. Height's visit to Los Angeles, there are going to be a great many other organizations involved with her activities during that time. Dr. Dorothy Height, a dear friend, a true legend, the president of the National Council for Negro Women since 1957, winner of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1994, of the Congressional Gold Medal, which was voted to you in December of 2003. And I want to read some language which I think is only an understatement in that congressional resolution, which says, Dr. Height is one of the preeminent social and civil rights activists of her time, particularly in the struggle for equality, social justice, and human rights for all people. An understatement, and we will learn why this evening. But also I want to say that one of her proudest achievements, and one of the proudest things that I'm now able to call you, is an author. The author of Open Wide, The Freedom Gates, and after our conversation on the stage this evening, we'll have a book signing and reception upstairs, and I urge you all to get copies of this remarkable book. But before we get into our conversation, I actually have a special award that I want to give to you, Dr. Height. In your book, you describe what it was that made it possible for you to go to college. Dr. Height read an advertisement or a poster in a gymnasium which said the following: would you like to go to college? Enter an oratorical contest on the Constitution of the United States, sponsored by the IPPO Elks of the World, win a 4-year scholarship. Dr. Height, who was a debater and a great orator, entered that contest. It makes a fascinating story because you had to overcome a lot of obstacles in the course of winning it, and won a national contest to go to Barnard College, except there was a problem. Barnard College already had its quota of 2 African-American women. And so after the deadline was over, she heard about NYU, where our daughter is at college now, I'm proud to say. And Dr. Height went to NYU they looked at her all A's, amazing record, and said, even though the deadline is passed, we must admit you, and you say you loved every brick in the building and the school after that. And there are a lot of bricks at NYU today. But I want you to know, and you may not know it, that at USC we have one of the very best debate programs in the country and the world, and one of the best speech programs, and they are part here of the Annenberg School. And so the head of our debate program, Gordon Stables, has prepared for you the special award, which says the USC Annenberg School for Communication proudly presents a Lifetime Achievement Award for forensic contributions to Dr. Dorothy Height, whose lifetime of leadership and service embodies the highest values of forensic education. So. At the beginning of your book, the first paragraph, I want to read it because it's such a prescient statement. In your first paragraph you say, I think of my life as a unity of circles. Some are concentric, others overlap, but they all connect in some way. Sometimes the connections don't happen for years, but when they do, I marvel. As in a shimmering kaleidoscope, familiar patterns keep unfolding. And the fun is that here on the stage, we have two, and we will have three people, or four if you count me as one of them, people who are part of that kaleidoscope that keeps, and that concentric circle that keeps unfolding. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of the people on the stage to engage in a conversation with you about a part of your life. And the first person on the stage who will be doing so is Adam Clayton Powell III. Adam Powell, in his own right, was a producer and reporter for CBS, ran news divisions for radio stations in New York, and ran the news operations for National Public Radio. Later went on to become the senior vice president of new technologies for the Freedom Forum, was also the station manager of the Howard University public television station in Washington, where they devoted on the day of a documentary about your life a 3-hour evening to your life. And he's now here as a professor, visiting professor of journalism at the Annenberg School. So Adam Powell will start off the questioning, but I can't help adding the fact that Adam Powell's father, Adam Powell Jr., Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was, of course, a great congressman and political leader, and I hope we'll hear later about how he really started off a major part of your social activism. And Adam Powell's grandfather, Adam Powell Sr., you don't get to be senior until there's a junior, but the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, a great minister in New York, actually made it possible for you to take a life-transforming scholarship trip to England. So our first interlocutor will be Adam Clayton Powell. The second, I have to say immodestly, is my sister, Holly Cowan Shulman. I followed Holly various ways over the years, although I'm older than Holly. She's, for those of you interested in international broadcasting, wrote a great book on the Voice of America. She's a historian at the University of Virginia who is an expert on first ladies, and particularly on the work of Dolly Madison. She's recently brought out a book about Dolly Madison. And among the things that she does at the University of Virginia, and as we will see later, is to put together a remarkable collection and a website about something that Holly's mother and my mother started with Dorothy Height, called Wednesdays in Mississippi, which they started in 1964. So Holly will ask you about more of your life. And then later we'll be joined by Judith Fawcett, who is a professor here at USC, and we'll introduce her when she arrives, but whose mother has been at least a great admirer of yours, and I think feels that she knows you, who's a physician in Chicago. And so it's going to be a wonderful conversation. After the conversation, we are going to invite everybody to a reception, and it will be a very nice reception indeed, in our East lobby above here. And we particularly invite you all to buy copies of Dr. Height's book, which she will be happy to sign for you. I want to start with the first question, and it's really with a memory from your book. It's an amazing scene that you describe, which takes place on November 7th, 1937, the day on which you came to know two of the women who were most influential in your life, Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, and in the process learned the importance of and your role in opening wide the Freedom Gates. Can you describe that scene and those women for us?
At first, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here with you and Holly and all the rest of us, but also to say thank you for the award. And I will try to prove that I can hold up to a speech award. Well, you know, on November the 7th, 1937, I had been on the staff of the Harlem branch of the YWCA for just about 3 weeks. And although I was the assistant executive, I expected to fill in things. When you are the newest, youngest member of the staff, you usually get those assignments no one wants. And that was a Saturday, all-day Saturday, and to be there to escort Eleanor Roosevelt into a meeting Mrs. Bethune was holding. Now, that was at a time when the wife of the President of the United States could drive her own Thunderbird, park it at a Harlem street for 2 hours, come into the YWCA, make a speech, and leave, and then go back and go into her car and go on up to Hyde Park, all by herself. And her only advance was Dorothy Height, who almost missed the trick because I had done everything to have every place straight. There were 3 entrances to the building, the administration and the residence, and then there was a service entrance. And before I knew it, Mrs. Roosevelt arrived, and one of the custodians came running. He said, "Oh, Miss Height, Miss Roosevelt's gone through the service entrance, past all the garbage cans and pails and all that after all we had worked on." But I recouped from that. But that was a very important day for me, because as I was returning, Mrs. Bethune said, "Please come back." She said, I told her my name and all. She said, "Because we need you." And I went back. And before I could get back in there, Mrs. Bethune had put me on the resolutions committee. And the first resolution I wrote had to deal with child labor. And the second one was minimum wage, and I'm still working on minimum wage. And the next year, Mrs. Roosevelt invited me. That was 1937. A few months later, Mrs. Roosevelt invited me to be one of 10 American youth to spend the weekend with her at Hyde Park, where we made the plans for the World Conference of Youth. And that was a very significant experience. And speaking of the circles, it's very interesting. For the rest of those 2 women's lives, they were a great influence in mine. And I started off with Mrs. Roosevelt, then in my youth, and I ended up with her on President Kennedy's commission on the President's Commission on the Status of Women. So that, and I was assigned by the commission to place the wreath as she on the first year marking her death, so that for the rest of their lives, they were an influence in my life.
Amazing. Adam Powell, let's start off by just a conversation.
Also in the 1930s, you had a number of anecdotes and memories and themes running through your book that go back to the 30s and into the 20s about the role of the church. We always hear about the centrality of the black church in the civil rights movement. But you have some very personal and very important ties with churches that really helped shape your life and your career.
Yes, and I graduated from high school in 1929, which, you know, was the year of the Great Depression. And I went to New York to college to go to Barnard, ended up at NYU. But during that period, I would say the greatest influence in my life came from the church. I joined the Abyssinian Baptist Church, which at that time was celebrating almost its 100th anniversary. It was an old church. And Dr. Adam Clayton Powell, Sr., was the minister. Believe it or not, I played basketball at the church on the satellite team. And there was a minister who had a program, Mr. Seymour Hill, who had some special training session at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, and I worked with him at the church. Dr. Powell Sr. was a tremendous man. He had a great sense of humor. And a young woman, Olivia Stokes, who was a member of the church, and I worked with him to, as he wrote his memoirs, and he had us to do the proofreading. I learned a little bit about proofreading working on Marcus Garvey's newspaper, so that I could be helpful with the proofreading. But one of the most important things that happened to me was that through this United Christian Youth Movement, in which I was active, I was one of 10 American youth selected to go to England to a world conference in the churches. And so Dr. Powell calls me up and he said, "Dorothy, I hear you're going to England." I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you better come around and tell the church about it." So on Sunday night, and I think we then had evening services, Sunday evening, I told a story about going to this, that we were going to be Christian youth building a new world. I told them about the economic order and what I was going to study. And then Dr. Powell looked at the church and he said, "Dorothy's a mighty smart girl, but you have to go to Europe and she can't walk on water." And so that when he raised $200 that night and gave it to me, I thought I was the richest person in America. But it, $200 was a whole lot of money at the time, if I could tell it to you. And then Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who I helped to, my first action in trying to get something done was when Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. called us together. And we looked at our community. People in Harlem would say to you, "I'm going to 25th Street." They didn't mean 25th Street. They meant 100 25th Street. And many never really, I think, went far beyond that. So that most of the merchants on 125th Street found that they were really enriched by the spending that we did. But there was no one working there. And Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. got me into my first activism to be a part of that group with the slogan, "Don't buy where you can't work." And we went through the community saying to people, "Don't buy, you can work." Another girl, we went in teams, and I, it seemed very tough now, but I was very sweet and gentle then. I had never thought of doing such a thing as picketing. And so another girl and I were assigned to go to Sam's record shop. We went down to Sam's record shop, and when we got in there, we talked to him about hiring some of our people to work. And he looked at us and he said, "Why do you come in here? Go up 7th Street, 7th Avenue there. There you've got a Spears furniture store. Because you see, you couldn't take the furniture out of the store. But if I hired you here, you would steal my records." Oh, I had never heard anybody say anything that so mean. And my partner and I went back and we told Adam, and he sat us down and told us how to go back there and pick it and get a message straight, and don't let him say that to you, and so on. And we went down, and Sam was glad to open up his shop, and we finished because we ticketed up and down before his store, and we got others, and kept it going until he gave in. And so I have to say that was my first really active, direct action. I had sent money for the missionaries, and I had done all kinds of other services. But it taught me one thing, and that is that unless it takes somebody in a community who will stand up and say, this is wrong, and do more than talk about it, but get people into action. And that's one thing I learned from that you have to, and even Dr. King said the same thing years later, you have to get people in action in their own behalf. That's what you call empowerment.
You mentioned another connection which will strike many people in the room who are either journalists or journalism students. You mentioned that you were working on Marcus Garvey's newspaper. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be in journalism and how that affected you?
During those times, there were so few jobs, and I was a student at NYU, and there was a student whose family was pretty well-to-do, and he was very unhappy. He was a journalism student, and he was very unhappy about having this job. He had been assigned it as a fieldwork student, and he kept complaining and complaining. So at the end of the semester, I said, well, why don't you recommend me? I wasn't a journalism student, but I did know something about English, and I had learned a lot about writing and speaking and so on. So he did. That was a life-changing experience for me, because Marcus Garvey took the position, and you know that he led the largest movement related to blacks, related to Africa, that had ever taken place up to that time. And though he was exiled in 1927, his spirit, his teachings were as alive in that little Negro world office as if he were there every day. Because his teaching was that black people had a great history, that we didn't have anything to take second place for, that we also could not afford to be less than excellent. And Bill Merchant, who worked with it, used to say, don't tell them you've done your best. Your best cannot be good enough for the Negro world. You may have to be excellent. You may have to do better than you thought you could do. And till this day, I think people who work with me will tell you, I could almost look at a paper and see the one error. Because they say, well, how did you do it? I had one secretary when someone said to her, I don't see how she should, if she tells you it is, look it up. Because that message got through to me. And he not only said, some people said black is beautiful. That's true. But he said, black is strong. Black has history. Black has a contribution. Black has to be at its best. And he got me trying to do that.
I have one last question. You tell a very interesting story in your book about an experience you had when you were outside the United States and in Europe, where it wasn't the law, segregation was not the law, but that another American who was traveling, not with you, but just happened to be traveling, insisted that the segregation, the practice of segregation, as was the case in the South and much of the rest of the United States, be extended to your travel in Europe. And you stood up in an interesting way, which you wrote actually surprised yourself.
Well, that again was when I was, back in 1939, there was a World Conference of Youth at Amsterdam, Holland, and I had been there. And after the conference, it went on to the continent, and I went at a hotel in Heidelberg. I got into the, what do you call it? They take you back and forth in the bus, little bus that takes you to town to go shopping. I got in and I was sitting comfortably. And the manager came out and asked me, please come in. I went in with him. And as I went up the steps, I noticed that the bus took off. And so I said to him, but you're making this of us. He said, oh, no. There was a white woman who said she would not ride on the bus if you were on it. And I said, have you pulled me off the bus? And I don't remember all I said, but I must have said quite a bit. Because he suddenly looked at me and he said, if you were in your own, you're saying so much. If you were in your own country, wouldn't you be lynched? And I said, so in my country, it is true there is lynching. But it is also true that people, white and black, are working against lynching. And I'm one of them. And then he kind of passed away. But for me, it was an experience that I've had many times since, when being outside of the country, having to defend, not able to say to him, you're not telling the truth, there is no such thing as lynching. I had to acknowledge that it was here. But I think that many of us who are African American, as we travel, find that our citizenship gets challenged in so many different ways, and our loyalty to our country is challenged. I think that we always have to stand up for our country, even, and then say to ourselves, it's my country, right or wrong, but it's my country, my right to set it right.
In a minute, we're going to turn this over to Holly Shulman, but first of all, I want to welcome somebody who's had another, actually Black History Month event, Judith Jackson Fawcett, Associate Professor in the Department of English and the Program of American Studies and Ethnicity, and Director of the African American Studies Program at USC. And I said that when it's your turn to question Dr. Height, you're going to explain what your connection with her is through your mother. And I know that that'll come up momentarily.
Great, thank you.
Holly Shulman.
Well, I want to start with the civil rights movement and ask you talk in your book about...
Just can I point out that we had the picture of the younger Dorothy Height, and now we have a new picture up on the screen of Dorothy Height and Polly Cowan.
Dean Cowens and my mother with Dr. Height, 1964?
Yeah, 64.
We'll go back to that picture in a minute. But I wanted to ask you first about the Council of United Civil Rights Leadership. You were the only woman in the Council of United Civil Rights Leadership. First of all, I think the creation of it is an interesting story. But also, you were the only woman. And that raises a whole series of questions of what it was like to be the only woman, what the civil rights movement meant for women, what the National Council was doing in a double role to help women as well as African American, and particularly African American women and children. It's a bit amorphous, but perhaps you'll take on.
Well, let me start with what you were saying first, because I think it's a little known part of our history. But the group that later, with Dr. King, A. Philip Randolph, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, James Foreman, and that group did not start out to be the leadership group related to the civil rights movement. The Sonic Foundation, through Stephen Curry, its president, had called us together about 8 months prior to the moment it became all organized. And he said, we want to make a study as to why it is that the philanthropic community cannot be more generous to the needs of the black community. And each of us took an area and we were studying it. But on June the 12th, 1963, when Medgar Evers was assassinated as the NAACP director in Mississippi, Stephen Curry called us all and he said, we've all agreed that we were going to meet, and we've done that. We didn't ever send any substitutes. We met every 4 weeks, and we spent whole days together sharing and talking about the issue. But he said, we now have to do something. And he called together 100 of his friends at the Carlisle Hotel in New York City. It was very strange. The first message just didn't get out because Western Union lost them. But he would not give up. Stephen Currier went to the head of the organization, and the next day they were delivered. And he had 90-some people came, and the largest amount ever contributed up to that point to the civil rights movement was raised by Stephen Currier. At that session, each one spoke about what was happening. Roy Wilkins made a brief speech, but he had to go to the funeral of Medgar Evers at Arlington Cemetery. I could talk about what was happening to young women in the hands of the civil rights, of the law enforcement officers in those makeshift jails down in the South, in the areas of the civil rights movement. And Whitney Young spoke up and said that we all knew more about the problems than we had the funds to deal with them. And that meeting, after receiving those funds together, the group decided to unite and to incorporate itself as the United Civil Rights Leadership. The press later called it the Big Six and several. I don't know how they got the six because there really were seven, because I was in it. But, sometimes they didn't see me. But the whole effort took off with that kind of drive, which did not start. And that became the group that developed the strategies. And we learned several things. There was one time when there was a little tension about whether or not the Student Nonviolent Committee, as acting as students will, was upsetting all the good work the NACC had done. And then Dr. King said, now that we're out here marching, we've made the NACP look respectable. And then we all concluded there was no way that we were going to try to fight for freedom that was going to please those who didn't want us to have it. And so we had to keep moving. In the middle of all of this activity, we were able, out of all of it, we got the Civil Rights Act of 1964. One of the things that I feel, and people always ask me the question, how did it feel to work with such great men? And all I can say, it felt fine. But it also meant that I think we became a group of persons who recognized each other. There was a sense of being peers at work. I never had the feeling of being second class in that group. On the other hand, there were many times when I got left off pictures, and some of my friends, some of those who were friendly in the White House, said to me, "You're always in the end," and so on. So I learned how to get in the middle of the picture, so I wouldn't be cut off, because often they didn't think of it. And often the press would go to speak to the men, and who wants to step ahead of a Dr. King or a Roy Wilkins? We respected each other in that fashion. And so that kind of activity all meant that we came up with legislation. We were able to go straight to the White House and put our case before them, get support. The Civil Rights Act of 64 was passed, and then it was going to come into full fruition and to be activated on July the 1st, 1964. There was the idea of having freedom schools in Mississippi, which Bob Moses, an algebra teacher in the North, had decided to be good. It's hard even to describe now the kind of conditions that there were. It was not only the sitting on the backs of the buses, but it was the climate in which, even on the first day that we were in Mississippi, we found that there were those who were threatening us, trying to make us frightened in every possible way. I have to say that I cannot describe enough what it meant to me to have a friend and who had come to us to work during the civil rights, during the period we were organizing as United Civil Rights Leadership. And she was Polly Cowan, whose son and daughter are right here today. And as she is here in this picture, she became a very dear, dear friend. And on her way to England with her husband, Lou Cowan, she wrote me back a note in which she said, they're calling all of the students who are coming from the Ivy Leaf colleges going into the South. They're calling them communists. Because you have to realize that it was not only those who were black who were suffering, but anyone who tried to change the situation was so classified and they suffered if they were identified. And so she said, I think it would be very good if we could get interracial teams to go down there. And women, she said, of the Cadillac crowd, who would go in and feel free to move, but would all have talent and bring something to the situation. She said, we know these people are not communists. She said, my children, Paul and Jeff and Rachel are going. And she said, we could go in on Tuesdays, work in the Freedom Schools on Wednesday, and go home on Thursday. And we set up a plan whereby women had to register in and commit themselves that they would come to study together, to plan together. Because we even had to get a plan for how we would meet in our racial groups, how we would come together. I know sitting here in California, it's hard to believe that you took a risk when you brought together a group of women of different races. So as we went in, we always separated and obeyed the laws as far as we could. As we arrived, the whites went to the white community, the blacks to the black community. But our plan was that we would always meet at the end of the day as an interracial group. And one of the things that I'll never forget is a time when we were in a car, Polly Cowan and I, and we were going into Hattiesburg to a small Baptist church where they had one of the schools. Our job was to kind of see how the teams of women were carrying out their work. Because we said to them, this is not a come and see thing. You have to do something. They either had to teach in the school or bring something. They had to do something. So we would go from one to the other to see what was happening. And just as we looked back, we saw a white car following us. And as we stepped into the church, a Molotov cocktail came through the window. And it sizzled. Well, a young man, white student from Oberlin, went to the organ of the church and played the Hallelujah chorus. And everybody stood and sang it as if we had been an organized choir. The moment when you realize the risk that was taken, the opportunities that you saw to realize what literally was happening to people, where the White Citizens Council was putting up all kinds of signs that would say, like for instance, the speed limit here now is 10 miles. Now, it has been, whatever it had been, they just make up one. And then they would see one of the cars go by with some of our young people, then they pulled them and put them in jail for breaking the speed laws. So that whites and black went out into harm's way But I think the thing that was so valuable was at the end of each day, as we came together, there were women who would say to each other, this is the first time we have met across racial lines, but we will never again be separated. And there were women who went north, and they, till this day, many of them, have continued to work. And we call it Wednesdays in Mississippi because the main activity took place on Wednesday. That was Polly Collins' idea. And we were a good team because she could have the idea, but I could do the other kind of stuff, and we would get it all together. But I think the thing that I feel it says to us, it is that it's so easy to say, this is such a big problem, there's nothing we can do. But that it is so important, even now, to say, there must be something we can do, if no more than bring people together so they understand what is happening, and they will find ways to be effective themselves.
I think you've answered all of my questions without my asking them. And
Okay, so maybe we'll turn to Professor Fawcett. And first, maybe you could tell, what is your family connection? We've talked about concentric circles here.
Well, it's interesting because I called my mother this morning, who is en route from Chicago to New Orleans to my grandmother. It's also Mardi Gras next week. I asked her, I said, I have the pleasure of being on a panel with Dorothy Height today. And I said, and she's someone I've heard you talk about so many times. And my mother, as a civic leader herself in Chicago, a younger generation, but still a leader, I assumed that there would be some aha moment that I could then recount tonight, but there wasn't. And she said, well, I've known about her since I was in high school. She said, and I've known her, so I can remember meeting her 15 or 20 years ago. But she couldn't recall a specific time that Dr. Height would remember. But the instance of me being able to call my mother to ask about an incredibly important historical figure was interesting to me and actually relates to the question that I would like to ask, which is to think about the ways in which this question around concentric circle, or what I'd like to think about, certainly within certain generations in the black community, I call the 3 degree of separation issue, because it's usually not even 6. You call someone, you think about someone who you know at church who knows someone else. So I grew up in the same church where Whitney Young's sister attended, right? So it doesn't take long to kind of get yourself to another person. And I also think my mother, who is a native of New Orleans, both my parents, who is about to celebrate the 50th anniversary of her high school reunion in May, who graduated from high school 2 weeks before the Brown decision came down, and always thinks about the ways in which her life might have been changed, but realized that her children's life would be forever changed as a consequence of the decision. One of the questions I thought would be, certainly comes out of my own teaching experience, is to ask Dr. Height what you might say is the legacy of the civil rights movement for a post-civil rights generation, for a generation who doesn't have the benefit of 3 degrees of separation to get to you, in terms of thinking in those ways, and that everyone on the panel here actually has some kind of direct relationship to you in that way. What is the legacy for students born, many of our students here born since 1980, for trying to make sense of something that seems very distant, and clearly, as we think about it, is absolutely not distant at all. So I would be curious to know, for a lot of the undergraduates in the room, what you might say to that.
As you were speaking, I was thinking that I'm part of a group that was called a group working on the Congressional Committee on Women's Issues. And we have just issued a report on women in the year 2003. And the young woman who was editing it said, well, let's use the figures DAR. So DAR means to me the daughters of the American Revolution. And she said, I mean DARs, daughters of a revolution. And I thought about it as you were speaking, because in a sense we would have to say, to young people today, you are the sons and daughters of a revolution. The revolution isn't finished, but you are the sons and daughters of a revolution that this year celebrates 50 years since the Supreme Court voted 9-0 that segregation was unconstitutional. But when that happened in this country, I think there was joy, certainly in the African American community and in all of those who love justice. But we have a long way to go. You are the inheritors of open doors, and you need to know how they got open. You are the people who today have the laws, the Civil Rights Law. You have the Voting Rights Act. You have the Housing, Fair Housing Act. You have the whole principle of affirmative action, which was set in motion back in 1957. You have the signs of progress that have been made. Because you will see today, there are more people of color in elected office, public office. There are more women. And the woman issue has come to the fore through the Civil Rights Movement. That you have more women and people of color in corporations. But you also have the unfinished business. Poverty has not gone away. We have discovered through our progress that when we're talking about racism, we're not really talking about interpersonal relations. We're talking about the thing for which Dr. King died, which was not about a dream, but about changing a system. We're talking about a system in which racism is deeply embedded, drawn out of the background of slavery. And we have made some progress, but there are still too many people who do not acknowledge it. And because until they acknowledge it, we will not eliminate it. So that you are the inheritors of a revolution in process. You are the inheritors of an effort to make the dream that Dr. King talked about, the American dream, a reality, not just for the few, but for the many. You are now at a place where those who even have the opportunity through the Civil Rights Act, through the Title VII, to go into hotels and motels and the like, do not have the economic position from which they can pay the check. They can check in, but they don't have the money to check out. And so therefore, they have opportunities, but they don't have the ways to take advantage of them. You are the people now who have before you the challenge of seeing how it is that those who died gave their lives to get people to vote, to get the right to vote. The issue in the South is most largely the right to vote. We have the legal base for the right to vote, but now we have to get the people out to vote. So that I think we have to see that where we are today is far from where those who gave their lives thought we would be. But they went as far as they could go. And it's up to this generation, I think, to see how now you see where it is and move us forward. I feel sometimes that we have become so comfortable, so much more comfortable, that with all the problems we have, we are more comfortable than the people who were in the past. Because the overt segregation and discrimination and racism isn't there, but the covert is there. And if we don't deal with that, this country will be in worse condition, because we will have built into our mores and customs the evils that are in those systems of segregation, those systems that deny women their rights. So I think you have a tremendous legacy, but you also have the legacy that shows you not only Dr. King, but little children and youth and women gave a lot in the civil rights movement. You had the legacy to see the progress that was made when people were determined that they were going to work for change. They didn't just accept the conditions, they worked for change. And I think that's the legacy that you have. A lot of work to do, but I think that you have more to work with today than they had in those days. And we have more access to information, more ways to get the message out, more ways to learn how to get the message out so that we are not just indoctrinating, but we're empowering people because we give them the facts, the information. If we see information as really the critical issue in our world today that we can share in a way that helps to move us forward. So I have great hope because I think we have a long way to go. We've got more things to work with.
You know, I can't think of a better way to close this session. I was going to open it to questions, but how can I? I also think, Dr. Height, you've once again proved yourself the winner of the forensic contest. No challenge. Upstairs, we're going to have a reception, a chance people will meet you informally and to buy this magnificent book. On behalf of our school, thank you so much.